list. But to get us started, I wanted to make sure we had a lay of the land in terms of what taxes already exist related to fuels. And so, Mr. Barnett, thank you very much for joining us. We're hoping to spend between 5 and 10 minutes just doing a high-level overview of what those taxes are and who collects, and then we'll shift over to the revenues and where the revenues go, and then we'll be switching over to the data related to this kind of reporting.
Great. I'm more than happy to supply that information. And I have about 5 minutes of information on fuel taxes.
Oh.
Great. So this is my first presentation or testimony over Zoom. And for the record, I'm Ted Barnett with the Joint Fiscal Office. So feel free to wave your hands extra dramatically if I'm missing a question or need to stop or pause anywhere.
Thank you.
So, we're going to first start with fuel taxes. These taxes are outlined in 33 VSA 2503. It's outside of the normal tax statute that's in human services. And this outlines a 2-cent per gallon gallonage tax on heating oil, propane, kerosene, and other dyed diesel fuel delivered in Vermont. It also outlines a 0.75% gross receipts tax on the retail price of natural gas and coal. And then finally, there's a 0.5% gross receipts tax on the retail price of energy. Those in statute are scheduled to sunset June 30th, 2024. And then I finally wanted to note, we'll return to this later in the slides, that fuels used for residential heating are exempt from sales tax, but fuels sold to commercial entities for specific purposes do get charged some sales tax, and we'll talk about where that goes. So on slide 3 or page 3, I have a table here that outlines the different breakdowns of the 3 different fuel taxes, to speak. On average, they all pull about $10 million per year. And those proceeds go to the Home Weatherization Trust Fund, which supports the program that weatherizes. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. For people who are streaming, it would be great if they could see your presentation. Can you share your screen?
I can definitely do that. Let's see. So share screen. And then we're going to do this.
And also, while you're doing that, people should note that we will be posting this presentation to our website as well. Great. And
great.
Now we see your screen. Thank you.
Perfect. Of course. So looking at different areas of the fuel tax, we have the heating oil, propane, kerosene, and dyed diesel share on that 2% per or 2 cents per gallon. There are on average about 200 million gallons of those fuels that are delivered, and that raises anywhere from in the low 5 millions to 4 million. And then there's asterisks on the sales of natural gas and coal because there are fewer than 10 filers, and the tax department does suppress that data. On sales of electricity, there's quite a good bit more in sales, but the 0.5% on sales of electricity generates, again, about the same amount in revenue, and that those two together generate about 9 million. The 10 million at the top of the slide is some of the suppressed data.
Okay. Can I a quick question? So those asterisks, can you just say again for the committee why they are asterisks?
Sure. Yes, that information, the tax department, when there are fewer than 10 filers, they suppress that information just as for confidentiality purposes.
Okay, thank you.
So that is the fuel tax. On heating oils are generally subject to also a petroleum distributor licensing fee. That is outlined in 10 VSA section 1942B, and that is 1 cent per gallon on heating oil, kerosene, and other dyed fuels that does not include propane. The proceeds from that licensing fee go to the Petroleum Cleanup Fund, which generally cleans up and removes underground fuel storage tanks. Could be at a gas station, could be propane, things that are underground that are leaking, that are causing environmental damage. The revenues from that licensing fee are generally about $1 million per year, as you can see on the table in slide number 5. And then finally, for fuels and the sales tax, I did want to mention that while most sales of fuels are exempted from sales tax, fuels sold to commercial entities for non-manufacturing and non-agricultural purposes are subject to the sales tax. JFO estimates that there are $3 to $4 million in sales taxes on fuels that are collected each year, but 100% of the sales tax goes to the education fund. So that is a really broad, high-level overview of fuel taxes and the different bins that they go into. If you all have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, but that is all I've prepared for today.
Senator Watson and then Senator White.
Thank you. So wondering if this tax data, like where the asterisks are, is that suppressed from JFO as well?
That is suppressed from tax. We are following what tax does and reporting that information as suppressed.
Sorry, so you have access to that data?
No, we do not.
You do not?
Sorry. Yes, we do not have access to those data. We request the information from the Department of Tax.
And so, okay, and so they're the ones that are providing the asterisks, so to speak, not specifically JFO.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
So what?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. One of the reports or studies that is currently in the process of being looked at around dealing with our heating fuel, I think contemplates an additional tax on fuel. Do you know or have any understanding of what the revenue would be if we were to impose a sales tax on the currently exempted fuels? Is there an understanding of what that revenue would be or a place to find that information?
I do not have that information on hand. I can definitely see if work has been done on that at JFO in the past and get that for you if we have it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then one other question, the column 1, gallons of heating oil, propane, kerosene, etc. When you receive that data, are all those types of fuels aggregated into one number?
Yes, they are.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other committee questions on the fuel taxes? Great. Thank you so much for jump starting our conversation.
Of course, happy to participate.
Thank you. With that, so I want to invite Secretary Moore to join us at the table. She has, thank you for fitting us in. I know you have an obligation that's coming up shortly, so your first at bat.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And just to frame up the conversation, so we were just looking at the taxes to help establish that the lay of the land in terms of data. And I would think, I know there are conversations going on between different agencies and departments already, so I want to be respectful of that conversation, and I also appreciate that conversation. I'm hoping that this committee can do is, in a certain way, facilitate that by saying, if there is a need for, I think, if there's a need for data that's not legally allowed currently to be shared, that we would make a statutory adjustment that would allow for the sharing of data that other operating areas need. So in a way, if I think about it, this from a sort of a nerdish point of view, I'd say I'd be trying to define a set of all the data we need. Then look back and map it. Where could it come from? And then create the permissions so that it could flow into that shared pool of data that we need. If there's data that we need and it doesn't exist yet, then I'd look to fill the data gaps by going back to sources that could generate the data.
Yes.
And it's that kind of holistic picture that I'm hoping we can, the committee can come up to speed a little bit on. You're already ahead of us. And then, again, to come back, if there's statutory action that's required, that we could contemplate what that would be and how we can express it correctly. So that's the preamble.
Yes,
Back to you.
well, thank you. For the record, I'm Julie Moore, Secretary of Natural Resources, and I think the few slides I put together this morning, Senator, very much match with your interests. First, just to talk a little bit about current data sets. There are existing state data sets that play different roles that are tracked by ANR, DMV, Public Service Department, and the Tax Department. And some of them are focused on fuel sales, some of them are looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact, some of our data is also looking at other priority pollutants. In addition, one of the data sets that we rely on is information that's submitted through a system EPA manages, which is their greenhouse gas reporting system. And then there are also a couple of larger data sets from USDA and the Energy Information Administration. Our current interest in those data is really focused on the production of the Vermont greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecasts. And so the purposes that would be required as part of S5 are somewhat different than that. And just want to make sure I flag what those similarities and differences are. But in general, the data sets that we're using currently have some fairly significant limitations, probably the most significant of which is that there is a lag in the data sharing. It's not really a lag with state partners. It's a lag with the federal or regional data sets that we then pull into our inventory. And as you can see,
Are those from EIA?
some of them are from EIA, some of them are from EPA. They have something called, I believe, the SIT tool, and I am not going to be able to recall what that acronym means. But there are different federal agencies collecting different sets of data that are useful to us in building our emissions inventory. We are on track to produce the most current inventory probably next month, and that's going to cover only up through 2020. So just to give you a sense for the lag in our ability to get the data in, do our analysis, and push the report back out.
So if we were to make all the adjustments you might hope we could make with in-state data, would that eliminate the need for that EIA data or the EPA data? And could it help eliminate the lag?
I wouldn't want to go so far as to say eliminate the need, but maybe reduce our reliance on. I think it provides important context. One of the challenges is obviously we have some fairly permeable boundaries with adjoining states where Vermonters are purchasing fuel in New York or Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Similarly, tourists are purchasing fuel here. And so having some of that regional data is helpful in trying to paint a larger picture, but it would certainly help improve both the quality, the granularity of the data, as well as I think the timeliness of the data. And then the other piece I flagged here, a limitation on the data set currently is related to the state data, where we don't necessarily have the granularity we would need, as your last guest spoke to. We don't really break out fuel products, particularly on the heating fuel side of things. And so have an aggregate volume, but not information on individual products. The next slide in the packet talks about the work that we currently have underway on our measuring and assessing progress tool, because the greenhouse gas inventory was not actually developed to support policy design. And therefore it doesn't really thrive in thinking about specific programmatic initiatives and the ability to estimate costs. So as part of the work of the Climate Office, they are developing an RFP for this measuring and assessing progress tool that will track specific practices. For those of you who are familiar with our clean water database, at least in my mind's eye, it looks a lot like that. It's the clean water database for climate practices. So it would get at things like, instead of stormwater ponds and acres of cover crop, it would get at things like number of heat pumps installed and homes weatherized. It won't replace the greenhouse gas inventory, but fuel data will be more responsive to those types of metrics that we will be tracking in that measuring and assessing progress tool. That said, the measuring and assessing progress tool, by virtue of the Global Warming Solutions Act, is broader than just emissions. It needs to include metrics around things like resilience and adaptation and community engagement. We are on track to put the RFP out for that project the spring of this year, and we believe it'll take us roughly 2 years to get the system up, running and populated with initial data.
You answered the question.
Okay, great. And then just the last piece is some reflections on what I see as the agency's goals for future fuel data reporting. Very much to your point, Senator Bray, looking to take advantage of existing reporting requirements and adjust and harmonize them. There's some issues around the mechanics of data sharing, and I'm sure Commissioner Bolio will be able to speak to that in more detail. We also need better understanding of some components of the universe, including who the fuel suppliers are. I think that requires some clarity around the definition of obligated entities. I've sort of heard it talked about as both individual suppliers as well as wholesalers, and frankly, I'm not clear. And to the extent it's down at the level of fuel delivery companies, that's a largely competitive and unregulated market right now. And so we don't necessarily know who all the players are. Also that data I spoke about previously in terms of fuel products delivered and consumed, and then trying to think about the weather related noise in the system. The graph I have on the right-hand side of the slide is looking at heating and cooling degree days. But just, right now, the way S5 is drafted, there are annual requirements based on a prior year fuel sale, and just would flag that this is a really noisy system. And that may not be the right point of reference for doing the work. But the bottom line, from my perspective, is really that better data, it will lead to better decision making. And so, as you noted, we have been engaged in an informal working group with staff from the tax department, as well as staff from the Department of Motor Vehicles and Public Service Department, to try to see what's out there, as well as have a fairly comprehensive view of what we think is needed.
Thank you. Luckily, we're not trying to use cooling days at this moment.
Correct.
That's
even noisier.
Really noisy signal.
Yes.
Okay. That's very helpful. Any committee questions for Secretary Moore? And again, I think what we're trying to do is play. It's always awkward for us to come into a discussion and process that's already been happening interagency, and we don't want to be stepping on toes, but we do want to be able to assist when there's a proposal from the work group. So to sort of jump to the punchline, I'm wondering if amongst yourselves, since you're already a working informal working group, if not formal, if you can come back to the committee with a proposal next week, week from yesterday would be helpful. I don't know what the timeline is for you, just let us know, but to say, here's, you had this discussion, for the time being, here's the kind of statutory adjustment you would need in order to be able to get that data that you agreed amongst yourselves should circulate more broadly. Or that there's a new, I talked to Commissioner Bolio a little bit the other day in the finance about disaggregating data. So it would be new data. But that would be very helpful
I will commit to seeing what we can do. Certainly, the focus of the conversation has been on kind of modifications to that form I have shared around when I was in here last week, and looking at a more granular data set. Yeah, thanks, Senator Lyon. I think we're making good progress in that space. And then there's the data sharing component. Like, to me, this is the most urgent piece, right? To start to actually collect that data. The data sharing component, and certainly Commissioner Bolio can speak to this in more detail. It's a slippery slope. There are lots of people that would like lots of access to different data sets that tax holds. And so just need to be really thoughtful and not try to open a really big hole in how they're able to protect confidentiality of the data they receive. So that's a work in progress, but we'll endeavor to do what we can to get back to you next week.
Okay. Senator Watson.
The MAP data collecting tool, the intention there is that that data would be available to any policy-making body like the PUC or.
Correct, and also to the public. And we have what we call our clean water dashboard, and people can get way into the weeds of the clean water data, but it also rolls it up so that it's more, I think, user-friendly to the broad public, and know that our partners go into that database to look at different performance metrics over time. So again, that is absolutely the intention, to have it be sort of a single stop shop. And we have an interagency advisory board that was part of the governor's proposal related to the climate office last year, and this is an area that they're working on too, to try to ensure that this one repository becomes sort of the place not just for ANR but for all of the work of state government.
Cool, great, thank you.
Does ANR have data that is confidential? I mean, I'm sure you have like regulatory actions to take and stuff like that, but in general, is most all your data public?
By and large, you're right. We do have some personally identifiable information that relates to regulatory programs. And then there's also some information, and I'm going to get way out over my skis here, but through the use value appraisal program that relates to tax data, where we again have a strong partnership with the tax department to appropriately manage that data. But generally, the work of the agency is sort of open to the public.
Thank you very much. Questions? So thanks for shooting in and visiting. I know they're going to keep on going.
Shoot out, back out. So thank you very much for your time.
I'd like to turn next to Mr. Landis Marinello, who's with the PUC, General Counsel at PUC. The S5, people are, I'm sure, aware. It's has data needs, so we wanted to pause and check in with you and help get your data needs on the list. The other question I have, Ms. Marinello, is have you been participating in this group that Secretary Moore, Commissioner Bolio, et cetera, are members of?
Thank you, Chair Bray. Kyle Landis Marinello, General Counsel for the Public Utility Commission. No, we have not been part of that group. And in terms of the data that we would be looking for if we were given the Clean Heat Standard program, we did have in our red lines that we submitted yesterday a request for an addition that would direct the tax department to give us the information that they get on the different fuel dealers who are making retail sales in Vermont and the amount of sales they're making and the payments that are made that way. And I'll just add a couple things on that, which is that data, we would need it to be specific to the fuel dealers. We wouldn't want that all aggregated. We would want to see which dealers were selling how much. And we would want that to be publicly available. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that that's just the general practice of the Public Utility Commission, that we want every document we receive to be available to the public, unless there is a very dire need that it be held confidential. For instance, we do have some infrastructure and the electrical infrastructure that has confidential information related to it. We do have entities that request confidentiality for matters that they see as protected business practices, but we really scrutinize those requests because a lot of times what a business entity sees as necessary confidential business information is not, in our view, actually necessary that it be confidential. And so we have a very strong preference that all information that's given to us be publicly available. And the last point I'll put on that is just a technical reason for that as well. We have an electronic case filing system, EPUC, which does an incredible job of managing all of the documents that we receive from parties, all of the orders that we issue in our proceedings, and all of that information is publicly available. But one thing that EPUC cannot currently do is handle confidential documents. And so if the information from the tax department were transferred to us as a confidential document, that would create some internal issues for us as well, in terms of it's just much more difficult to handle that type of information. And so, what we would be looking for is as much information as possible on the retail sales that are happening. If anyone has information on the wholesales that are occurring of the heating fuels, we would love that as well. But I'll see what the Commissioner of Taxes says on that. My understanding is I don't think any state agency currently is tracking that, but if someone is, we'd appreciate that as well, and we'd like it to be publicly available.
One practical implementation question that occurs to me is, you're getting retail sales data, but the bill also creates the obligation. The obligated party is the first. It's for first sale in or into Vermont, so it will end up that wholesalers will end up with an obligation. And so I'm wondering if you've given some thought as to how you would access data for those people. One, to know who they are, and then two, to get the quantitative data you need. So the upside is that there are fewer wholesalers than retailers. Still, have you thought that through? And is there any likely source of data that exists in the state, or is that going to require some detective work on it?
Yeah, I think we would need to give that some more thought. And I think that to the extent we can impose requirements on the in-state providers, in terms of if a wholesale entity that's out of state is selling to a wholesaler in Vermont, even if the obligation is falling on the seller that's out of state at the wholesale level, we may want information from the in-state wholesaler to try to match up the numbers we're getting. And so part of what I think we would need to do if we end up with this program is look at what the tax department has in terms of its numbers from a retail sale level. If they're showing 250 million gallons of fuel sold at the retail level, we would be looking at what's the data we have from wholesalers and making sure those line up.
Thank you very much. Anything else you want to put on the table as a data need going forward at this point?
No, thank you, Chair Bray.
Okay, thanks very much. With that, then we'll go to Mr. I'm not sure if I'm going to say this, Mr. Peacock.
That's right. Thanks.
Thank you for coming over.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good morning. I'm Philip Peacock. I'm an analyst in the Department of Public Service. I have just a couple brief points, no slides, if I may, before taking your questions.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think you, Chair Bray, you said at the start, you're seeing who has the data and who needs the data. We have some of the data, but it's probably not the data you're looking for. So let me just run through two programs that we are responsible for, which has perhaps some of it, and I'll get into details. So on the issue of fuel prices, we do collect during the heating season in partnership with the federal the Energy Information Administration. We collect fuel price information for heating fuels, kerosene, fuel oil, propane, from a couple dozen fuel dealers around the state. Because it's a federal program and they provide a small amount of federal funds for that, it's covered under the federal confidentiality law, so we can't share any particular information about those fuel dealers providing the prices. So it's sort of it's not very helpful for S5 purposes. In terms of fuel volume, there's a law that goes back to 1979 following the 70s oil crises. In Title IX, it's Chapter 110 and Chapter 112, which was intending late 70s, early 80s to look at the amount of petroleum stored in state, thinking that there would be another global supply disruption. And so it's not about the focus is not on sales or consumption, it's on storage. And so facilities that store petroleum of 50,000 gallons or more have to report to us monthly. How much is stored, how much goes in and out. So the challenge there is that it's not clear what compliance is, because many dealers will drive across state boundaries, pick it up in Albany, of course, New Hampshire, bring it back. And so in theory, they never have to file those reports for us. So
Because it's not officially in storage, it's in transit or something.
yes. And so we receive only a handful each month. So it's not very reliable data source. My final point, which doesn't align exactly with S5, but we frequently get the request from regional planning commissions and town and city planning commissions who are working on the enhanced energy plans under Act 174, that they have no idea how much fuel is sold in their region or in their town, what type it is. And so that makes it impossible for them to know over time, is it changing? Are their own efforts, focused local energy efforts successful? I don't know how to plug that into the S5 efforts, but it's something that's on our mind because we're dealing with planners who are working on enhanced energy plans. And we can take the statewide data and do our best guess to estimate it for them, but it's imperfect.
Senator Watson?
Around the storage, is it publicly available to know how much storage there is? Or maybe we don't know, or it's voluntary because people are, sorry.
It's not voluntary,
Right.
but because the rulemaking dates from 1983,
Yeah.
I think compliance is probably low.
Okay.
But we don't know. We don't know if compliance is good or bad.
So, but regardless of compliance, the amount that you do get reported, is that publicly available?
I think I could sum it. I could provide a total, but I don't think the individual reports, I think they're protected.
Got you. So,
I'd have to look at Title IX, which is the commerce title, to know exactly.
sure. So like if you may be able to tell us like in aggregate
Yes.
how much it is.
Yes, at least among those facilities that are reporting, which again, it's
which we don't
a
know.
handful.
Yeah.
It's, fewer than 5 each month.
Okay. I just want to put out that I would be interested to know how much we have in storage, if that information is available.
It sounds like almost, who knows, a little bit of vestigial statute, like we're not using it anymore, but, okay. Any, Sarah, what was your question?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. I really appreciate your point about energy committees, because what I experienced was we had the EAN dashboard and folks were using that for a period of time, but it didn't really give them a granular sense of how to meet their goals. So they're kind of just out there hoping that they could reduce the thermal sector of their town's energy plan. So I don't I appreciate your comment because I agree. I don't know how we would resolve that concern within this bill. But I do think it's something that we should talk through because our municipalities have these plans and they feel obligated, but they really don't have a clear pathway to implement it or to know if it's working. So that's a problem. And I just wanted to flag that if there was a way.
And, beyond just the planning significance of it, if you have a certified town energy element in your certified town plan, you're given a substantial difference when appearing before the PUC rather than just in consideration. So there's legal implications gaining that status of having a elements in your town plan. So it'd be good to know that we're facilitating the pathway there for we have been things like we've provided money, departments provided technical assistance. RPCs have provided technical assistance, the LCTs provided technical assistance for people to aren't right now. But it's helpful to know if there's a data gap, which I hadn't heard about.
I mean, Heartland, our community in our area has now basically, from as their description, they're grassroots collecting that data. And in fact, that makes me a little more concerned because it's not always great to have people's information in that kind of situation. And then just kind of building off of that, one of the pieces that seems to be difficult with accessing the data is because folks might be on fuel assistance, for example, and that's private information. Or they might be getting there's something to do with how it relates to their benefits in general. Do you have any concerns with that as is that something that you've considered?
It's not something I've looked into. Yeah, again, when there was a proposal a couple of years ago at the last session 4 from Senator Perchlik relating to getting more data for Act 174 enhanced energy planning. And it was always from the supplier.
So not us.
So not looking at customer.
Have you been participating in this formal or informal work group?
I haven't personally, but the department has. I've been TJ4, so I've been speaking with them.
Just want to make sure no one's getting left out who would like to be in. It's going to be the place to be. So, Senator Watson.
So you're collecting fuel prices for kerosene, fuel oil, propane, etc.
Yes.
Is it with this form?
It's we call an email. So the way it works is it's under the Energy Information Administration's SHOP, State Heating Oil and Propane Program or Price Program. And so EIA nationally wants to know how prices are moving for each of those heating fuels regionally, and actually have Vermont, we publish on a weekly basis during heating season, Vermont specific information. And we publish it all year round, so we cover the summer as well on a monthly, not weekly basis. So there's, I can't actually say the exact number, but a few dozen fuel dealers around the state, and some of them have multiple locations, so fewer companies ultimately, who are called or emailed every week, and they provide information, how much you're selling a gallon heating oil for. And so we submit that to the EIA, and then the EIA puts it up on their website to please. Not individual price, the average.
And you post it on your website.
And we post it on our website.
Senator Watson, you look like you have a question.
Thank you, appreciate that. I guess I just find that surprising. It's just like fair enough, it's a couple dozen, that's something you can, that could be managed, but it's not a form, which I just think is really interesting.
I think the move, this was a couple years ago, from phone calls Monday mornings to emails was a great advancement. And but many of the people were calling, they are small fuel dealers. And we call some or email some, and then federal government EIA does some of the larger entities with multiple states in their service area.
And this couple dozen that you're calling, is it always the same, or is that like the universe of people that you that exists?
It's a sample from the total population that EIA knows about, and that sample changes. Some fall in, some fall out, some come in. sample exact each.
And so it changes from year to year.
It changes from year to year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, and thanks for your help on the data. With that, turn to Commissioner Bolio. I think it's good to see you in another room. I think
Yes.
this might be your first visit ever to this committee.
I think it is. I don't go outside my lane very often.
Well, we're trying to give you a bigger lane to drive down here. So, yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on all this. And as you're well aware, it seems like a lot of people would like to have access to your data. You have,
Not the first time I've heard.
you have good data. So,
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. So I guess I would start by saying my understanding of this issue is much more limited than the folks you've heard from before, right? I really am a tax guy, and so I'm here because I have heard that we have data that might be useful to folks in this discussion. So I thought I would just talk a little about how our fuel tax form works today, and then talk generally about tax confidentiality provisions and my general mindset when we talk about expanding those confidentiality provisions, or should I say expanding the scope of who has access to the tax data. So the first thing that I would say, and I think folks have heard, and it sounds like you are all aware, is that our fuel tax return does not, it aggregates a number of different fuel types because the rate is the same, right? And the general reason for that, right, is we try to do what's most efficient for tax administration, right? So if the rate's the same for all of it, we don't necessarily need it itemized. We also don't track units of electricity or then natural gas and coal, right? Because it's just a rate on sales. It would not require statutory change for us to change our forms, right? The tax commissioner has discretion to adjust the form. I would say the internal discussions that we've been having so far, it might be generous to call it a working group, Mr. Chair, but we have been having discussions with ANR and stakeholders. To the degree that it is useful for us to disaggregate those lines on the form, we can provide aggregated data on the disaggregated lines. That is to say, as long as it's not individual taxpayer data, and we generally say we have to group by at least 10 taxpayers, then we can share data publicly. That is not a huge lift for us to do, to change the form to the degree that that is useful. We would want to do so with a reasonable time frame, right? We're in tax season now, and so our focus is there. So we'd probably be looking at something like the summer to be able to do that. But that requires no statutory change. The authority exists for the tax commissioner to adjust forms. I think that's relatively low impact for us and for our taxpayers. And so if that's useful, I'm happy to be part of that discussion. Generally, tax confidentiality, as defined in Title 32, 3102, basically says everything that comes into the department is confidential. It's defined as return information, and that might be the things that feel intuitively like return information, like the actual information on the tax return, but the statute is actually quite broad, and essentially anything that comes in. So if you sent us a letter about your tax return, that would also fall under that. Tax return information will be confidential. And there are very limited exceptions to that. And I always urge caution with expanding that, right? The whole bedrock of the US tax system, for better or worse, is voluntary reporting, right? Folks report to us, they file their taxes, tell us what they owe. And one of the covenants that we have with taxpayers is that you can tell us the truth because we will not tell anybody else, right? We get money orders every year from folks that it's not entirely clear where that money came from, right? It may not have been completely above board, but we don't ask those questions, right? That's part of the system in the United States. So I always urge caution with expanding that. And even within those discussions, part of what's relevant to me is what is the end result of what that data is going to be used for, right? So for instance, some of the things that we have exceptions to our confidentiality statute for are to help other state agencies do confidentiality checks, compliance checks on things, right? So one of the ways that the confidentiality law was expanded last biennium was for us to provide information to the Department of Labor, who was administering unemployment insurance for self-employed individuals, right? So we were able to share some data there to help them with compliance checks. Hearing today that there might be a desire to publish the data publicly, I think is a bigger discussion as well. And could create real challenges, right? We want to make sure that we aren't creating compliance challenges where folks are worried about what might be published publicly that then changes their behavior on what they report to the tax department, which puts compliance pressure on us, right? To make sure that what's actually coming in is the truth, if the real concern is not misreporting of taxes, but instead where that data will end up later. So I'm happy to participate in those discussions, but my general message to the committee is that I generally urge a lot of caution when we are expanding tax confidentiality. Certainly if there are other opportunities to get at that data, that is by default usually our preference, but recognizing that we are often the ones who have high quality data and the ability to utilize it. I understand why we're part of the discussion.
Sure, thank you. Can you, I forgot, where in statute do you define the blanket confidentiality and the current allowable expense?
Yeah, so it's all under Title 32, 3102. And so that has both the confidentiality provisions and the exceptions to it.
Great, thank you. Senator Watson?
So the data that you shared with the Department of Labor, was that aggregated or disaggregated?
That was, and I'm actually not sure to what degree the sharing has actually occurred, but we are allowed to share individual data at that point. Really, anytime there's no confidentiality provision that will ever prevent us from sharing aggregated data. So right, again,
Sure, right.
as long as we get to a grouping of 10 or more taxes, we're generally happy to help out however we can. So anytime there's an exception to the confidentiality law, it's to get under that cap, and really it's usually talking about individual companies, individual persons, individual taxpayer data.
Thank you. So that's one, that's helpful to know. Just want to run an idea by you that obviously, like, I'm sure it's been talked about, but it seems to me that, like, this is the existing form that you will collect. If clearly this is what is considered to be confidential now, any changes to that, like if we needed more data, disaggregated, or, potentially things like, was this from a wholesaler? Like, where was the purchase? Where did the purchase occur? Which would be useful for the purpose of the mechanism of the bill. That seems like that would be outside of this form, or in it. I think I know the answer to this question, but I just want to make sure that I know if this, like, you couldn't distinguish between, like, this part is going to be confidential and this part is going to be made available to the PUC or whatever.
Yeah, no, that can be done in law.
Okay.
So essentially how that would happen, right, is that the law would just state which elements of tax administration are confidential and which are not. Let me back that up a bit. I think the way that it would be done probably, and I would very much defer to legal counsel, would be to call out the parts that are not confidential, and then by default everything else is, right? And that has happened in one case that I know of with landlord certificates. A portion of that is public, but not all of it. So it has been done before. What you were describing as well is of having other elements on the form that may be useful. I mean, that's an interesting discussion that again, I would urge. We care about tax administration, right? And so again, whatever pressure that gets put on the department in terms of doing compliance for places that are not tax administration is challenging for us, right? And so I think if part of this discussion as well is, well, it's not even just disaggregating these things, it's like understanding where it came from and all that. Again, I would urge maybe a discussion about, is the tax data the best source for that? Or should there be another reporting element that may not also come with the same confidentiality provisions that tax data comes with, right? So often when we're looking around state government, and I get pulled into these discussions from time to time, right? It's twofold, right? It's like, one, is it worth it for us to have the confidentiality provisions in tax expanded here? And I do think that that's a sincere philosophical debate that has to happen as well, right? That if we do this here, again, there are other areas of state government and external stakeholders that really want that data. Why did I say yes here and say no in other spots, right? But the other part is just the mechanics of it, right? Like, is it actually the most useful for us to get it? If it's not something that we care about for tax administration, it's probably not something that will get a lot of compliance from our department either, right?
Well, and just so you know where that comment is coming from, I've heard from the fuel dealers, like the desire to limit the number of forms to fill out,
Sure.
right? So if it can be in one place, you know, even if like this part is, anyway, yeah, even if this part is relevant for tax purposes, but this part is relevant for S5, then, you know, that's, anyway, that's why I'm wondering about that, but I respect that, you know, it may not be all relevant to taxes specifically.
And I actually really appreciate that comment, because that is one, as I'm thinking through this, just from my own chair, and again, trying to answer that question about if we say yes to an expansion here, but not like, how do I answer that question for everybody else?
Right.
That point that you just made, I think, is a really good one in this space, right? That the taxpayers who would be affected here, it's a relatively small group, and so it's easier to communicate with them, right? And so we could actually theoretically get the feedback from the stakeholders who would be impacted by the fact that their tax data would be shared to say, yeah, we're cool with that,
Yeah.
right? And that does make it a lot easier for my chair if that is the preference from those who would actually be having their tax data shared. Again, not saying that that's the end of the discussion, but you know, normally when we're talking about a tax type with many more hundreds or thousands of taxpayers, it's hard to understand the perspective of all of those stakeholders,
Yeah.
and that's got to be part of the conversation.
Just to make sure you follow that scope question. Do you know how many filers you have for this?
Yeah, it's about 200.
So that's an interesting idea, going out to your customers, saying, how can we, what do you think about this? It's a novel and attractive idea. I've never had the IRS ask me about the form.
I'm sure you have thoughts.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. Commissioner, to this thread of conversation, the way that we have the bill drafted is a very detailed rulemaking process. And I'm wondering if you feel like some of the points you've raised, this kind of back and forth around the form, do you feel like the rulemaking process and how we've put forward the bill would facilitate those questions being answered? Or is there something that we need to address in the bill that would give you the leeway to do that?
So I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that question. So I reserve the right to come back and say, I goofed up on this. But I don't think, I mean, I don't need rulemaking to make adjustments to the form,
Okay.
right? And then I would advise against using rulemaking to, certainly I don't think we could use rulemaking to create the exception to confidentiality. I guess maybe you could try to put some guardrails around that, but frankly, I'd rather do that in statute so that it's very clear what those parameters are. So no, I don't think there would be a big element for the rulemaking for us.
Okay, thank you. But you, through our process of creating this program through rulemaking, there are certainly ways that you could work with the
Sure,
PUC or work with this new tool with ANR
sure.
as the program is rolled out. There's nothing in the bill as it's written that prohibits you from moving forward with these changes if it facilitated a better program.
So I'm not sure I'm familiar enough with the whole bill to answer that
Okay.
question. I mean, again, my like limited part about the tax confidentiality, I think would probably be better handled in statute, and then I'm not sure how rulemaking would necessarily impact that after.
Yep, I think my main reason for asking the question is because you're bringing up, this conversation is very interesting. And I know that at times we hear from constituents who say, who have read the bill and are worried that we aren't addressing kind of some of the more nitty-gritty pieces of it, of how logistically it will move forward. And I think this is one of those that people have identified. And in my view of the bill, I'm comfortable with some of the lack of very fine detail on questions like this, because I do think it will be addressed through the process of creating the program. And what I've heard from you today is that you could do this separate from rulemaking. It could be a part of a program development process. We don't need to call it out necessarily, but you reserve the right if that's not accurate.
As long as this we're talking about is the form change.
Yeah,
like, The only point of tension there might be if stakeholders are saying, we want all this stuff on the form that doesn't have to do with tax administration. Again, then I would urge those stakeholders to say, is this really the right vehicle to be doing that? Right? If you want all this other information, why go out of our way to put it into the tax space that then comes with all these confidentiality provisions that we have to work through? If really the information is not what you want on this form, I'm not sure I have to be involved at all at that point.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
On the form itself, how often do people file? Is there an electronic form? And do you have just a rough sense of how many people file paper versus go online?
I virtually zero file paper. It might be exactly zero, but I can't say that.
Okay.
It's very, very close to 100% electronic file. We have an awesome computer system at the tax department for those who don't work with us a lot. It's called VTax, and it works really, really well. And we have all of our tax types are in what's called My VTax, and you can file through there. Some limited exceptions, but so it's awesome. Yeah, people file through My VTax for this tax type, almost exclusively.
Great, thank you. Any other committee questions for Commissioner Goyer?
It's,
Today.
well, I just wanted to say that I'm contemplating like 3 questions, right? So like disaggregating the type. And then who sold it to you and where did the sale occur? You don't necessarily need to comment. I just want to let you know that that's,
Yeah, I mean, again,
those might be the wrong questions. I don't.
those could end up being big lists, right? And so that kind of scope would lead me to say, like, is this really the right form to be doing that, right? Because then we'd be tracking a list of individual sales, it sounds like, that then aggregate into the lines.
Oh, yeah.
Again, I don't need any of that for tax administration.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
One of the questions outside the immediate scope of this data sharing question, I hear from time to time that there are people selling fuel oil, retail fuel sales aren't being reported to tax. So I guess there's a tax commissioner way more aware of compliance or lack of compliance than I am. How do you figure out whether or not those sales are actually happening, or it's just sort of anecdotal stuff that's not accurate? And then who would help you clarify that? And who would help you force if you found out, in fact, there was a repeat offender, not filing, but making retail sales?
Yeah, so we have a compliance division that deals with a lot of that kind of stuff. What you're referring to might end up as a referral on our desk. We also do cross-matching for certain tax types, right? Some of this stuff is subject to sales tax. So if we find companies that seem like they might be in this space and we see them filing sales tax but not fuel tax, right? That might trigger some kind of review for us. Sometimes we have a slam dunk case, right? And then we go there and we say, come on guys, right? And let's like work together to get on the right side of it. Sometimes we might have that's interesting. That's an interesting trend in the data, or there's a question there, right? So we might start with a letter that says, we saw this interesting thing. Like, do you think we're wrong? And if we're wrong, tell us why. Or if you don't think we're wrong, like maybe you should start to file and file amended returns, right? So we've got a number of different tools, different data sets, and also just boots on the ground that work on referrals as well to try to catch this. But no system is perfect. I don't want to say it is, but yeah, that would be generally the mechanisms that I identify.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And I'd like to invite Mr. Smith from UNLV to join us. Good morning. Thank you for coming over. And I don't know if we've talked to DMV ever before about data.
I was gonna say, so,
No.
so Mike Smith, Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Motor Vehicles. This is my first time ever in this committee.
Okay.
I got put on my calendar at 10:30, and when I showed up at 10:20, thinking I'm early, and saw your schedule in the hall, I had to show up, so I apologize for being late.
I have time.
So no, I haven't had the opportunity here. I don't have any slides. Those of you who know me know I can talk for hours, and you might actually have to tell me to stop at some point, but happy to help. A little bit about myself, been in the department for coming up on my 34th year. At 51, I could retire. I wish that was reality, but it's not. So I've been around for a while. I've seen a lot of various different things change at the department. In the realm of heating oil, we don't really dabble in that much, if you will. We're more on the fuel tax side for vehicles that are using the stuff on the highways. And I can go through, I guess I don't really know what you would like to hear from me. I can go through what we collect, how we collect it, what we do with it, the system that we use, give you a broad overview of the department in that area, or I can try to answer specific questions if you have them. Yes.
Well, thank you. So I don't know if you've been in the group that Secretary Moore has been, working with.
I'm the first one to say yes.
Okay.
We have our first meeting next Monday.
Okay. Yeah, and I think because her view is bigger than S5, it's all the data related to greenhouse gas emissions. Then I think that's probably why you're being invited to that party. And for us now, we're just focused on the subset of fuel that's used for thermal fuels that are delivered into the state of Vermont. So there, and it sounds like that's not, you don't see that supply chain.
But we do interact with, so individuals are delivering gas and clear diesel. They do report to the Department of Motor Vehicles. We actually utilize the same core system that the tax department does. It's from Fast Enterprises. It's 421, if you care what the name is. And we're in the process of transitioning our entire system over to Fast Enterprises system to modernize all of what DMV does. In May of 2020, we went live with their fuel tax system. So, and we track all information for gas, gasohol, aviation gas, undyed kerosene, low sulfur diesel, undyed, unblended biodiesel, and ethanol. So all of those are reported to the department. We have various different schedules that they fill out. I listened to Commissioner Bolio talk about, various different forms totaling up to that top page. That's our world. That's what we do. Each one of those fuel types has its own schedule. The distributors fill it out. We know where they bought it, who they sold it to. We get copies of the bills of lading. So product code, carrier name, carrier ID, transportation mode, how it got here, origin terminal, destination terminal, seller's name, purchaser's name, date it was delivered, net gallons, gross gallons, filled gallons, and exempt certificate. So, and
We have a complete system.
we do, and we worked with the Federation of Tax Administrators to obtain certification that our forms are uniform. This is and the tax department interacts with, because it's Federation of Tax, and we only have a small piece of that tax for fuel tax, but we've made our forms all uniform with all of the other states. Other states may collect additional data, but we do collect that data, and those forms are uniform.
You ran through the list of fuels a little too fast for me, but can you say which ones? I'm just wondering if any of them end up in something other than what we would think of as transportation.
So gasoline,
Yeah.
gasohol, aviation gasoline, not to be confused with aviation jet fuel. I don't know what the difference is other than one has jet. Undyed kerosene, low sulfur diesel number 2, undyed unblended biodiesel, undyed unblended, no, one was dyed, one's undyed, and then denatured alcohol, ethanol, which is the ethanol that's in the gas.
What's the low sulfur pieces for what is heavy duty trucks? Is that where that's?
Yes, it's the clear diesel fuel. Sorry.
Is there a way?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. It's so refreshing to have you in the chair. It's nice to see you. But what I also find really helpful is you have a very robust system for getting this information, and you work closely with the folks who you're collecting the information from, and you've developed this system over numerous years. and it seems to be working very efficiently. And I think one of the concerns we're hearing from fuel dealers in particular is that this new process would be an extreme burden. It could add layers of complexity to their business that they feel would make their business harder to do. Do you hear those kinds of concerns from the people you're working with now to collect this data? It seems like you've hit the sweet spot where I'm not hearing from my constituents who are reporting this data that there's anything awry or that it's burdensome. And if you could speak a little bit to that side of it.
Certainly can. And so and this is one of the first things that I had on my list is once upon a time, we did this with paper, pencil, and a calculator. That's how we calculated fuel tax. And then as Excel came along, we used Excel spreadsheets. So the information we're collecting today is not any different than the information that the distributors were sending to us in the past. So that's why I think we didn't hear any comments about, oh my gosh. We did not mandate electronic filing. I heard your comment on that. We set a lofty goal of 85% of the fuel distributors filing electronically within the first 2 years. We nailed it.
Nice.
We're at about 88% right now. Interestingly, as the system came out, we talked with many of the individuals that were upset. It's it's an electronic system. I've got to learn this. And the second time we talked to them, they said we love it and we're happy to not have to drive to Montpelier. So in many cases, especially from the IFTA and the IRP world, IFTA has the fuel tax component. I used to watch out my window as all these people would come once a month, file all their forms. Well, now they don't come park in front of DMV, they're filing electronically. This is a great benefit, not only for us, but for the distributors themselves. We're different than tax. We collect tax information. Our information is mostly public. We actually post right on our website. You can go in and you can run a report today for any month that you would like to pick back to May of 2020, when we put the system in, for how much fuel was sold. And it'll send you an email, and it's in your email inbox in about 3.5 seconds. It lists the motor fuel distributor, gallons sold, gains, lost, total due, cleanup fees, and then the 2 assessments, the motor fuel transportation infrastructure assessment, and I can't remember the name of it. We call them MIFTIA and NIFTA. But so all of that information is available on our website. There it is. Our statutes are set up different than the tax departments because our statutes do allow for the sharing of that information. I will say that fuel sales are very competitive. I remember a time where an individual wasn't filing and for some reason showed up on the report with zeros. And then we started getting all kinds of calls wanting to know where the fuel is going, who's delivering it, because they're all watching this stuff. And of course, we didn't answer those questions, right? But at the end of the day, it is a very watched system by the distributors.
Thank you.
And who has the obligation? So you were mentioning distributors a few times now. Who has the obligation to report to? Is it distributors or retailers or?
Distributors.
Okay, just distributors. So how big a pool is that? How many people distribute?
I'm glad I spent some time yesterday. That is 159 total distributors. We're collecting right around $97 million annually.
So they remit to you and then you forward to tax or how's that?
No, we this money goes into the transportation fund.
Yeah.
And then we put money into the petroleum cleanup fund and then those 2 assessments from the TIP bonds.
Senator Watson?
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. So the data that's available publicly is public right down to the individual distributor, not like an aggregate, groups of 10 or whatever. So that was one thing. The other thing I want to wrap my head around the distributors. So we're not talking about individual gas stations. We're talking about whoever is selling it to the gas station. Okay. And so what is your understanding? I think this question kind of came up, but I just want to make sure that I understood or really heard the answer. What is the overlap between these distributors that are reporting to you and those that might be selling fuels that could be used for heating? And the reason I'm asking is because biodiesel potentially, seems like it could be in the middle of that Venn diagram. Does that make sense?
Kind of, and I don't know as though I have a specific answer.
Okay.
Based on our statutes, if it's the blended biodiesel, 10, 20, 30% or whatever, that's considered just regular old diesel, right? That's where it's
Yeah.
lumped in based on our statutes. We do call out 100% biodiesel, but short of that, I don't have a good answer for where that.
Okay, that is okay, thank you.
You know what?
How did you get to know who the 159 are? I mean, it sounds as though you're reasonably, well, I get a question. Are you reasonably confident that you're hearing from all the people who have an obligation to file?
I would say yes. One, statute requires that they obtain a license from the Department of Motor Vehicles. And two, based on the fact that as soon as gallons start disappearing from one entity, they start calling and asking what's going on. So to say they're self-policing might not be the best way, but that's a lot of how we find out. You know, our auditors are out there. We audit these companies, we have conversations.
Okay, and then, so because we're trying to create in a way a parallel, a similar reporting system that would support thermal fuels, it's great over here that you have taken on this task for transportation fuels and you're getting good compliance. And it sounds like the form, the electronic filing seen is not burdensome by
No, because it was what they were doing before, except they don't have to do it on paper.
Yeah.
You know, and we didn't mandate, we still have a certain subset that do file by paper.
Yeah.
Our statutes do require that you make your tax payment electronically,
Yeah.
which helped with the whole process of checks and stuff like that. But
Senator Watson and Senator White.
Oh, no,
You're all set. Okay, Senator White, that's Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. What do you think the average time is that a supplier or distributor spends making sure that they are compliant in meeting?
I have no way to answer that question,
Okay.
I'm sorry. So, I would imagine, and going out on a limb, somebody who is selling a smaller amount of gallons is probably spending less time. And then if they're not selling the various different types of required reporting, right, it would be less time.
Do you, maybe another way to ask the question was, are you aware of any of the distributors having one staff person exclusively dedicated to this job?
I can't answer that, sorry.
Thanks.
Senator, thank you. All set? Thank you, Senator McDonald.
In the 70s, the speed limits were reduced to save gas. Who would we ask in transportation to learn how much extra gas is used for people that operate motor vehicles above the posted speed limits?
Like everybody on the interstate these days. Just saying. I don't know, but I could ask. I'm not sure what part of the agency would do that study. It's not DMV, but I can reach out to Michelle Boomauer and some others and ask and try and get an answer for you.
Thank you. So AOT might have, do you do any vehicle files, travel data, or is that pretty much through Trans AOT?
So interesting that you bring that up. So we are actually in the process of working to get some statutory language put through that would allow for us to hire a contractor to help design that system. So we've had many meetings on the mileage-based user fees, how to make it fair, how to apply it, how do you collect the information, how do you verify it's accurate. All of those conversations are going on right now. So I don't have a lot of good information other than the fact that we are working on that.
Thank you. We've had conversations in here for several years about how to support electric vehicles without having them fail to support the transportation infrastructure and that they're relying on just like the ICE vehicles. So. Any other committee questions for Mr. Smith? Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you in the committee, and it's very helpful.
Happy to come back to you.
Okay. And with that, I think, so it's been very helpful to figure out, I don't know what the answer, what the answer is yet, but it's encouraging to know there is a model to look at, and we'll have things to sort out going forward. So we're going to report back from Secretary Moore next week, and that can be helpful looking at whether or not we want to include language in S5. I can also envision that it might be, if that work group's not ready a week from now, that could be an issue caught up. They could be caught up in what the House has to build, something like that. So there's more than one way to get there. Okay. Anyone in the room here to provide testimony on this topic? Mr. Coda.
I just say one thing that the
Department, read yourself into the record.
Department of Motor Vehicles also has. Matt Coda for the record. I don't know, on behalf of fuel dealers. One of the other things that the Department of Motor Vehicles has is an enforcement division, people that carry guns and badges and drive cars with blue lights on. And when you're coming across the border, having a letter from the Commissioner of Taxes, and then another letter, and then a subsequent letter, but having someone that can recognize somebody who's selling fuel illegally in Vermont, for operating illegally in Vermont, is critically important to avoid, to create a compliance mechanism.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to say anything about, Mr. Marinello, I see you back on the screen in your hand, so we'll come back to you. Do you have any, I'm thinking about two things. One, we're trying to make sure that S5 is implemented. When implemented, 2026, there's time to get our ducks in a row. But it would also be helpful to know that pre-existing systems that relate to thermal fuels are being well managed in a way that has a very high level of compliance. If only, I think, for at least two reasons. One is because there's tax revenue involved, and secondly, because it just creates a more level playing field so that those who do comply don't suffer financial penalty for being law-abiding. So I don't know that it would have a place in this bill, but I would certainly want to. Committee, I think, would like to work with you to say, how could we help the current system? And I know, so one thought you have is that we need to have a compliance mechanism akin to what DMV has for transportation fuels. So that's the bottom line.
And there is overlap to Senator Watson's question. There is overlap, of course. Those that have trucks can put different fuels in those trucks and are registered to pay diesel taxes or gasoline taxes or both. It's two different forms with the Department of Motor Vehicles, and to pay on dyed fuel, heating oil and propane with the Department of Taxes. So some of the regulated entities are overlapped, not all of them.
Yeah. Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Gray. I don't know who would have this information, and I want to see if you would know. Do you have a sense of how many Vermonters are, like my family had done in the past, going to diesel or gas stations and getting fuel that way rather than through a fuel dealer?
Canning it.
Yes.
Yeah, so taking a 5-gallon can and
Or
getting either
bigger.
clear or bigger, and getting clear or dyed diesel in order to fill their oil tank. It's
Yes.
the same product,
Mhm.
exact same product, other than tax. In doing it, they do avoid the 2 cents and the 1 cent, 3 cent tax that is currently on it. But we don't have any records that indicate, we don't know how many gallons are sold of dyed diesel. Well, actually, Michael Smith might have some records of dyed diesel sales sold, but then, boy, that's a great question. You stumped me.
Okay, well, if you don't know where it is, then that means it probably doesn't exist.
Well, no, there is a reporting, so this is where so, right, we have on-road diesel over here, goes to Michael Smith at the Department of Motor Vehicles. We have heating oil over here that goes to the Department of Taxes, and then in the middle is what's called dyed diesel, at 30 million or so gallons. It has a variety of uses, some for transportation, some not for transportation. That tax goes to the Vermont Department of Taxes. However, if you are a distributor and you're selling clear diesel for non-taxable purposes, you are marking that off your diesel distributor's form that you file monthly with the DMV. So somewhere in that universe is those gallons that are sold to people that fill up their can with a pump and bring it to their house because they can't afford a minimum delivery of 100 gallons or whatever it is. I don't know how to define that.
Senator Watson? Thank you, Mr. Koenig. Mr. Lanus Marinelli, back to you.
Thank you, Chair Bray. I just wanted to make a couple quick comments in response to what Mr. Bolio said, Commissioner Bolio. One is I take very seriously the concerns he raised about lowering compliance. We wouldn't want to do anything that would lower compliance. Remember that the fuel tax that's there now is going to low-income weatherization, and that's a critical part of what the legislature is trying to do. And so I take that very seriously. At the same time, I think that overall what's happening if this clean heat standard is given to the Public Utility Commission is a lot more information that's currently seen as confidential business information is going to become public. So for instance, any entity under the bill as it's written now that is taking fuel in New Hampshire and then going to a Vermont residence and delivering it is going to need to report to us, the Public Utility Commission, the exact amount of gallons that they sold at retail. And so for the entities that are reporting that to us anyways, it's not really anything else that they would be disclosing by the tax form being made publicly available. So I don't know what percentage of the roughly 200 entities that would encompass, but it would be a significant portion of them. The other thing I would say is that, just so the committee is aware, in addition to the strict confidentiality provisions that Commissioner Bolio mentioned, there's also an existing Vermont Superior Court decision out there that has directed us and the Department of Public Service to not release publicly any information that's related to the taxes of utilities. And so right now the status quo is that information must be held confidential. And I completely take Commissioner Bolio at his word that he would be happy to change the form to make it a more useful form. But as he was saying, that he currently couldn't release the form unless the legislature made clear that the tax department does need to release that information. And I would also say even his willingness to change how the form is currently written. Again, I take that at face value. I'm not questioning he would do that, but we're looking at a program that's going to last for decades. And there will be different commissioners down the road who might take a different approach. And so that's another reason it's really important that the legislation make clear what information needs to be reported and that that's going to be publicly available, and that would help us with the enforcement of the clean heat standard if this program is given to us. And the language we recommended yesterday is asking the tax department to give us the list of entities that do that form. I do think what Senator Watson was saying earlier about having information about where they purchase that fuel, and we wouldn't need to know how much from each entity, but if it said a list of the entities and the locations where that was purchased, that would be helpful information. And probably the part that the fuel dealers will be most concerned about is the exact amount of gallons that they sold. Again, I think a lot of those entities will be having to disclose that information anyways, but the most important information is the list of the retail sellers, and I think where they were purchasing that fuel from as well. And we would also want to know the total amount of fuel by fuel type as well. that's the most crucial information for the Public Utility Commission to have if we're given this program.
It occurs to me that over time, there'll be different blends, and those blends will have different carbon intensities. And so you would need a more nuanced form than what might ever be of interest to the Department of Tax, you know, and the ability for you to manage that form, what I would call it a form, would seem like a important thing, because only your shop will really know how detailed you need the information in order to make sure that you're getting timely, accurate information in all the ways you need it to reflect the carbon intensity of all the fuels sold. So it sounds like we have more work to do to figure it out. I wanted a quick question in terms of who you're expecting obligated parties to be. I don't know if you were watching testimony prior to coming on. We had Mr. Hand in from the firm changed its name. Jeff Hand was in to talk about obligated parties and Dormant Commerce Clause, et cetera. But I don't know if you want to watch that testimony. We also had Laura Murphy in from the AG's office, who will be, I think, following up with you. There was a question about some language. But we were nailing down exactly who the obligated parties are. And my understanding from this morning's testimony is that in many cases, the local fuel dealers will not be obligated parties because they'll have bought from someone who had the obligation at the wholesale level. So it may be that some of our task is simplified because we're going upstream to fewer sources rather than having to chase down all the retail sales. So anything, so anyway, I would just recommend maybe listening to that testimony. I think loop back to you. I think we want to make sure we give each, well, especially the PC in this case, give the PC enough authority to be able to successfully carry out the tasks you're going to need to carry out under the bill. All right. Mr. Cody, you have your hand up. You have some information you want to share?
I also have a question.
For
Mr.
okay.
Thank you,
Mr. Ranello.
So in contradiction to the testimony earlier this morning, respectfully, my testimony from the prior week was that 80% of the retail fuel outlets buy some or all of their fuel imported into Vermont, so thus would be obligated parties. It's based on analysis we did last year for the Clean Heat Standard. So this involves everything from the Tony James you're going to talk to tomorrow, who can see the bulk plant where he gets all his fuel from his spot in Bellows Falls to North Walpole, New Hampshire, in his 2 trucks and his 1 other driver. But this also includes very large entities as well. It's an accident of geography, whether you pull from a Vermont terminal or an out-of-state terminal. There's no reason to pull from a Vermont terminal if you are in Windham County. Not when you have North Walpole there in Springfield, Massachusetts. When you're in Bennington, there's no reason to go up to Burlington when you go skip over to Albany. If you are in Burlington proper, the few fuel dealers that are left, because it's natural gas territory, it doesn't make any sense for them to go out of state. They just go to the 2 terminals in Burlington, Trackside or Global. So,
yeah. So I want to make sure I understand the significance of someone in Bennington or Bellows Falls hopping over the border to another terminal. My understanding is the seller at that terminal, though located out of state, by virtue of selling to a Vermont domiciled business, it will be that seller that will have the obligation, not the purchaser of the fuel. So not the fuel dealer that then going on to so-and-so's home or business.
so it's my understanding that would be a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause.
Okay, so we have, I think, testimony. Have you, I don't know if you want to watch this morning's testimony and work through that. The testimony we had cleared us of that concern as to the best of our understanding. So that was Mr. Hand plus the Attorney General. Well, a member of the Attorney General's staff.
So a North Walpole terminal, 11 terminal, Portsmouth to Springfield, Mass, Albany, New York terminal, we have to report their gallons to the state of Vermont.
Right, and out of whoever's selling into Vermont first sale, wholesale or retail, doesn't matter. First sale into or in Vermont becomes an obligated party.
So how would the Public Utility Commission know who has a position at the Albany terminal?
We don't have the answers to that now, but I'm saying we don't know. I'm a little less sure about that's not gonna happen. There are many instances in which entities located outside the state of Vermont have an obligation to report to the state of Vermont. So we're not gonna play lawyers in the committee. The lawyers have helped us sort that out. If you have a different legal opinion you want to bring forward, I think that would be helpful.
So the reason why the distributor is not, so a distributor is someone who takes it in a tanker truck and brings it across the border. That's what the Department of Motor Vehicles does. That's how we tax gasoline and diesel fuel. We don't tax, or we don't have a ability to reach into Albany and whatever terminal operator is selling there. It's the company that takes possession of the fuel when it is in Vermont, and that is not the terminal operator.
Sure. So I think, again, we're not the lawyers, so I think if you or someone who's representing your organization wants to bring forward a legal opinion, then we can evaluate that. We can have the Attorney General's office evaluate that. Mr. Haynes could help us respond. But I think the distinction that I see between the two things we're talking about here is the DMV is interested in retail sales. And this bill does not say retail or wholesale, it just says first sale in or into. So it will pick up wholesale transactions at some point. It could pick up a retail transaction.
Respectively, DMV collects the distributor, which is the entity that brings it into Vermont. Entity that brings it into Vermont for heating fuels, diaphragm, and propane. Can be very large distributors or very small distributors. Distributors of motor fuels are not that. They carry 9,000 gallon tanker trucks, 8,000 pounds. Distributors of heating oil and propane are running straight trucks, bobtails. So it's
Well,
there's a misunderstanding of how our fuel is distributed.
all right, so thanks for raising the question. I think if you stick to what, will be helpful to all of us, is if you have a legal opinion that you can bring to the committee that is, you were expressing concern with Dormant Commerce Clause. So that will be helpful. I think what we heard this morning was definitive in terms of citing other instances of other laws in other states, other programs that implemented that we would be consistent with. So that's all I can say for now. But if you have legal information to bring to us, great. And we'll have lawyers respond to it rather than, I'm not going to play a lawyer here sitting at the table. Senator Watson.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's not a separate topic. So earlier I expressed something that I thought might be true for fuel dealers, and so I just want to check that with you. In regards to this form that people fill out. And I said, well, I feel like I've heard that fuel dealers would like it to be one form, even if parts of it were like this is for tax purposes and this is for PUC purposes. Is that more desirable than having two forms?
So I haven't polled the membership to find out what percentage want two forms versus one form from a perspective of understanding what fuel is sold and counting those gallons, whether you're trying to talk about a reduction in fossil fuel for the greenhouse gas emissions or just talk about making sure we have compliance. Breaking out the fuels, frankly, I've tried to do that 15 years ago. And as long as I'm alive and in this building, I will still try to do it. We should absolutely break out the fuels: propane, kerosene, biodiesel, heating oil. They should be 4 different line items where you enter the exact gallon amount for when you file on the 25th of the month. That we should have had that a long time ago.
And
Well, this conversation may help that helpful change take place. Who knows? Senator Watson, sorry.
oh no, that's so So no opinion right now about whether 2 forms or like in addition to 1 form is better. That's
Yeah, who's collecting it? What information are they collecting? So there's a lot of unknowns, known unknowns there.
yeah.
But I understand what the goal is. I understand the need, because I get the same calls from my own energy committee. Saying, how many gallons do we sell in this? Well, we don't collect that. It's not available. There's different ways you can get at the data, but not without improving our collection mechanism.
Great. Well, so the silver lining of this 5 is may improve data quality and compliance across the board. Which will be everyone's committed.
And transparency,
Pardon me?
and lots of transparency.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Coda. Thank you, Mr. Landis-Marinello. Do you want to say anything more before you sign off on your end?
Thank you, Chair Bray. I think we've covered it. I guess the last thing I'll just put out there is I know there are some entities like a not-for-profit entity, for instance, where their tax forms do have to be publicly available. And so I think what we're talking about, and as Senator White just mentioned, the transparency part of this, it would be bringing into that type of model these new entities that currently don't have to disclose that information. So it is a policy decision for the committee to make and the legislature to make. And at the end of the day, if we have full compliance, we don't need to get the data from the tax department. We would be getting it directly from all of the obligated entities. But I don't think it's a good policy choice to assume the best case scenario. I think it's much more prudent to assume and think about the less than full compliance and try to have some additional ways to, one, know that that's happening. And if we see a difference between the amount of sales happening that's reported to the tax department and what's being reported to the Public Utility Commission, and then to have other ways of bringing those entities into compliance if we at least know who they are because that information's been provided to us. So we're happy to work on some language to kind of refine this a little more, the suggestion that we made of exactly what information would be most helpful to the Public Utility Commission if the clean heat standard is given to us.
Okay. If you can send that to the committee and copy Mr. Kowski, that would be great. Thanks very much. Ms. Manchester from JFO has been sort of shadowing our hearing. I talked to her about it yesterday. We're going to be talking about data. And so I don't know if you have any comments or questions or suggestions based on, you do a lot of work with data. So I want to make sure that if you have something to share with us that we hear about it, or if you need more time to consider things and participate in another way, that's fine too. It's not like a pop quiz.
Right, thank you very much. It's Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office. I must say that the fuel dealers and the heating fuels and so forth are pretty much out of my wheelhouse. I have been listening and I certainly appreciate the tension between the confidentiality of data from individual businesses and the need for public information on fuels sold and so forth. The one thing that entered my head was that somehow the greenhouse gas inventory is keeping track of different types of fuels and relating that to how much greenhouse gas emissions there are in the state. Is that through DPS or through PUC? Does anyone know?
I think my best guess, and it's a guess based on Secretary Moore's testimony, is that it's ANR that's has a legal obligation to publish and maintain the greenhouse gas inventory. And I think they're the ones who would like to have finer data, more timely and more granular data. In part because emissions vary by fuel type, and so when they're aggregated, limits their ability to be accurate in their assessment of what the any year's emissions might be.
Right, and of course, that would be at the aggregated level, right? They care about the total number of gallons sold in the state, not individual dealers. Yeah, so I don't have particularly words of wisdom on collecting all this data, but certainly I can see the viewpoints of all sides in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. If you do end up having further thoughts, let us know and we'll keep you in the loop. Okay.
Thanks.
So any other committee discussion, questions, et cetera? All right, thank you for everyone for leaning into the data this morning and the law. An interesting day for the S5 seminar group. And with that,